Have you ever seen something or someone familiar in an environment you wouldn't normally expect them? If so, can you name the feeling you get when it happens? Well, in case you didn't know, it can be described using one word: uncanny. And that's going to be what we're going to be discussing in today's video. So here's the best introduction to the uncanny. It commonly happens when looking at something that's familiar but slightly off, enough that it also feels unfamiliar. The uncanny blurs the line between familiar and unfamiliar. Take a look at this bar. Between familiar and unfamiliar, we have uncanny. The word uncanny derives from the word canny, meaning clever, shrewd, knowing, with the prefix un indicating something somewhat mysterious. The first person to really discuss the uncanny as a whole was the founding father of psychoanalysis himself, Sigmund Freud, in his 1919 essay titled Das Unheimlich, which translates to the unhomelike, the half-familiar, the uncanny. Freud draws on the idea of being robbed of one's eyes to be the most striking instance of uncanniness. Expanding on this idea, French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan describes three registers of the human experience. First is the imaginary, our first experience of something. The second is the symbolic, our unconscious associations with that thing. And the third is the real, which forces us to accept something beyond our comprehension, which is what Lacan describes as the uncanny. The most talked about instance of the uncanny is when it comes to resembling familiar faces. A face that looks almost like a familiar one in mind, but has subtle flaws that make it feel wrong, triggers cognitive dissonance, and it typically feels scary, weird, gross, and sometimes even funny. For example, I experienced this weird feeling when looking at this fan-made drawing of my characters, SRC Madman and HRG Madgirl. They strikingly resembled the characters I'm familiar with, but because they couldn't, of course, replicate them flawlessly, they didn't exactly feel scary, but rather weird. That is an instance of the uncanny feeling. Anyways, there are two related theories to this concept of the uncanny. First is the famous concept of the uncanny valley by roboticist Masahiro Mori, and second is Julia Kristeva's concept of abjection. We're now going to discuss these two theories. We're now going to discuss the elephant in the room, the uncanny valley. In case you don't already know, this chart shows how we react to humanoid figures of different realism levels. The more an object looks or acts like a human, the more positively we sort of react to it. That is until we hit a point known as the uncanny valley, where instead of empathizing, the affinity drops and turns into fear, weirdness, or disgust until it 100% resembles a human and affinity rises back up. Examples of this theory in action include humanoid robots, hyper-realistic CGI characters, and wax figures. This concept is very similar to what I talked to you about earlier, except the target is a universally familiar human. There are three major theories regarding the existence of the uncanny valley. First is the mate selection theory, which suggests that uncanny features signal low fertility for potential mates, although I don't really agree with this theory because it doesn't make sense to me why we would be afraid of someone just because we're not attracted to them. The second is the predator/mimic theory, which suggests that there used to be a human-like creature that posed a threat to us that either happened to look like us or was purposefully trying to mimic us. The last is the one I'm most convinced of, the disease theory, which suggests that we tend to back away from uncanny valley humanoids because they appear mortally diseased or dead, causing us to keep distances from them to avoid deadly pathogens. This makes a lot of sense to me because a lot of uncanny valley humanoids tend to have stiff movements, slender bodies, or pale skin, characteristics we find in sick and dead people. But now I'm going to talk about my opinion. I think uncanny things, whether resembling a human or a familiar real or fictional face, are weird or unsettling because they look wrong, as if something's up with them. And the uncanny valley also applies to sound and even communication and feel. Also, the uncanny valley effect isn't only experienced by humans. It's verified to be experienced by monkeys and macaques when shown a face that looks almost like their own kind. So the uncanny is pretty universal, but now let's move on to the next concept. Now we're going to talk about Julia Kristeva's concept of abjection. Introduced in Kristeva's 1980 book, Powers of Horror, defines the abject as that which disturbs identity, system, and order by not respecting borders. It's a profound sense of disgust and horror triggered when a person confronts things that blur the line between the self, the subject, and the other, the object. It's neither the subject nor the object, but a borderline entity that causes a crisis of meaning. Kristeva claims that the earliest and most fundamental experience of abjection is the infant separating from the mother's body to become an independent self. The maternal body represents an ambiguous space that must be partially repressed to establish cultural order. Examples of this theory in action include bodily wastes, corpses, and social transgressions, acts that cross cultural taboos. Now, if you think about it, the most familiar face to you is your own face, the one you've always been seeing in the mirror. The mirror stage is when a child is first able to recognize the face in the mirror as their own. So if you were to see what looks like your own face but slightly off, the uncanny sensation is at its most powerful. For some examples, doppelgangers incite a similar feeling as the one we've just talked about. They blur the line between what is you and what is not. But even familiar looking places with slight imperfections trigger a similar feeling. Liminal spaces are transitional places that are normally supposed to be crowded with people, but aren't. For instance, walking down the street at 4 a.m. feels liminal because streets are usually full of people, and when they aren't, it triggers that sensation. But how would it feel if while walking down the street at this hour, you randomly encounter a person you know? That feeling is the uncanny, a familiar person in an inappropriate environment. But in the end, it all comes down to ambiguity, blurring the line between animate and inanimate, human and not human, self and other, empty and full, alone and not alone. We don't sit well with ambiguity, and when it comes to the boundary between familiar and unfamiliar, the result is the uncanny. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel, and until next time.